me, here's a song in my heart. There's a song to be sung that can heal these broken men. Let us sing and we'll walk through the dark, hand in hand, hand in hand.
That's good morning. Is everybody hear me okay? Let me turn my video on. Good. Jess, just testing that you can hear me. I'm sure you can. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Velocity's webinar on the practical guide to getting started with Azure. There is a hand up already. I see Ravi. Jess, can you manage that for a moment? Folk, thanks very much for taking the time and the energy to join us on this Wednesday morning. We realize that it is well into the year and the beginning of December, and I think people, like we know, are pretty webinared out. William, your camera's on, young man. Yeah, people are kind of getting to the end of the year and wanting to pack it all away. So I really do thank everybody for making the time and the effort to be here this morning. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm sure that you noticed the banner on the top of the screen saying the session is being recorded. If you have any issues with that, please let us know. We will please make sure that you are on mute and and your video is cancelled. We just came off a webinar now where we had quite a funny little incident, so that was quite funny. And then also there will be questions. Please, if you can, put your questions in the chat on the left-hand side. You will be given a chance, or Garth will be answering those questions as we come to the end of the session. So really what's on the cards for this morning is we will do, I'll pass over to Garth in a few minutes, and then Garth will take you through the presentation. We'll have a couple of questions and then we will close. It's great to see some familiar faces here. Dityan, thanks for joining us. Mark from Axum, really, really good to see you guys here. Daphne and NK, thanks for joining us. Everybody lekker, and really everybody's welcome, and thanks for making the time again. So what is it all about? I guess it's all about the cloud, right? The intimidation of what cloud can be, hybrid, on-prem. Is it in infrastructure as a service? Is it software or platform? Is it a workload? Is it apps? It can be a journey that can be fairly intimidating, much the same as looking south and seeing the cumulonimbus clouds brewing over the Krugersdorp Hills. You know you're in for a bit of rain. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And on that subject, Garth is going to take you through everything that you need to understand. He's got a great presentation to really simplify the journey. It is not a sales-focused one, and neither is it superbly technical. It is really just to help you understand the basics of getting through the initial stages of your cloud transformation or your digital journey, whatever you want to put it. So I'm going to hand over to Garth. Garth is our senior solutions architect within the Velocity Group. He and his team have been responsible for some wonderful projects coming along the lines of migrations and implementations, et cetera, not to mention names, but they've done some proper work over Africa and throughout the globe. So welcome, Garth. Thanks for taking the time to present this morning, my mate. I'm going to hand on over to you, and good luck. Have a good one. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thanks for setting the expectations quite high there. Once again, thanks everyone for joining and spending a bit of time listening to me talk about Azure. This is one of my passions, and I'm share it with everybody. And, as Chris mentioned, we're here to help people get going in Azure. So I'm just going to share my presentation, and we'll get going. I promise it's just the slides are just there to help us keep track of where we are in the presentation, so don't feel you need to take too many notes. We'll have a practical demonstration. But let's get started on our practical guide to getting started in Azure. So we're going to address some of the main questions we come across, some of the main challenges, and some of the stumbling blocks that people have had in their cloud adoption. So what we're going to cover is, right at the outset, we're going to discuss some of the challenges. We're going to have a look at some of the key steps you can take to overcome those challenges, and we'll dive a bit into some of the specific decisions that you need to make as part of those key steps to success. Then what we're going to do is we're going to get into the Azure portal and actually go through a deployment. I'll discuss some of the things that you need to be aware of. It's not going to be a very technical demonstration, but we'll spend a bit of time focusing on the points that trip people up often and cause a little bit less of a smooth experience in their cloud journey. And as Chris mentioned, we'll have a bit of a Q&A just before we finish up. So if you have any questions, please pop them into the chat box and we'll answer those as we get closer to the end. So we're going to be a bit dynamic in the timing of our presentation today. I'm going to keep an eye on where we are in terms of questions that have been asked and what needs to be answered. So if we've got a bunch of questions, I may speed up certain portions of the presentation today, and we may spend we're going to spend a bit more time on the actual demonstration and practical steps. But let's dive in and discuss first of all the challenges. And the first one people face is simply the question on where do I start? They jump onto Google and they have a look at cloud computing, and very quickly they figure out that we've got the three big players in cloud. It's Microsoft Azure, Amazon's AWS, and Google Cloud. And then they have to look at the features and what they want, and they've made a decision. So we're big fans of Microsoft Azure, and so you've decided you want to go with Azure. Now you have to decide, am I going to look for a software as a service solution, a platform as a service, infrastructure as a service? What's the difference? And if you have a look at the very left-hand picture, this one here, you'll see Microsoft Azure is placed into the platform as a service. But in the middle one, Microsoft Azure is positioned as infrastructure and platform. However, when you look at the context of these articles, the information is relevant in the context. But when you don't quite understand the context, people get confused between what they're looking for. And they may see a picture like this left-hand one and assume now they're looking for infrastructure as a service, so Azure is not the right solution for them. And that can lead to the initial frustrations. It's just figuring out which provider I'm going for, what type of solution I'm going for in the cloud. And we find that that leads to the biggest question. Where do I start and what cloud offering is right for me? So we're going to discuss a little bit about Azure today, and Azure offers the full range. There's platform as a service, there's infrastructure as a service, and some of the offerings within Azure that they border the line between software as a service and platform as a service. For example, Azure Active Directory itself, it's specifically platform as a service. However, it's more like software as a service because Microsoft are taking care of all of the back end for you. So the Azure offering runs through all three of those key points of cloud. It gives you infrastructure, platform, and software all as a service. So the Microsoft offering is complete. So having chosen or having considered Azure, you're definitely in the right place to start. The next question people come up with is, okay, I've chosen Azure or I've chosen my cloud solution. How am I going to migrate to the cloud? How am I going to get my existing workloads into the cloud? Do I have to do it all at once? Am I going to stage it? And those are the next set of questions that start to come up. And then closely related to that is, when do I migrate to the cloud? Do I do it before a hardware refresh cycle? Do I do it right now? And there's a lot of factors that determine that. And us as Velocity, we're happy to consult with that. But we're not going to dig too much into that because that we can end up very much in the weeds on trying to strategize a cloud solution and a cloud journey right at the get-go. But these are the challenges that people face, new to cloud. They come across these questions, and once you've read all of the articles and everything, you end up sometimes just with more questions. For example, how are we going to manage our cloud? Once we've decided when and how we're going to migrate, what are we going to use to manage the cloud? And how are we going to keep cloud sprawl under control as a management? One of the unfortunate side effects of the cloud being so elastic and so capable and being able to grow so quickly is that people's environments very quickly get out of control, especially if you've given access to somebody who's not concerned about cost, or they're not concerned about keeping things neat and tidy. They can deploy resources quicker than you can imagine, and you can just end up with this mess of cloud, and now you don't know what to do with it, you don't know what's happening, and you end up with this huge cost associated with your cloud as well. And now you're wondering, how am I going to keep managing the cost associated with my cloud? Like we mentioned, where you've given people access, how am I going to keep it secure? So these are the key technical aspects we find people are stumbling across in their cloud journey. And it's something that they get a little bit confused about. They pause and they think, is cloud really for me? Do I need this additional management overhead? And do I really want to journey into the cloud? It seems like a lot more hard work than what I'm used to. But all of these points of concern can be overcome. And we're going to step through a few of those key steps to success and how we can overcome all of these concerns. And the first point is planning. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this quote: if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. And that was Benjamin Franklin who said that. Now, Microsoft Azure is not quite as absolute as this. It is very difficult to completely fail at a deployment in the cloud, but definitely you need to start with planning. Plan what you're going to move into the cloud, when you're going to move into the cloud, we'll discuss a little bit more about exactly what steps we need to plan in those specific decisions points. But the next key step is getting to know the Azure tools. Once you've started planning, hand in hand, you need to get to know what Azure is, what it's about. And what's great about Azure is if you go to azure.microsoft.com or you Google free Azure, you're going to be able to get a 30-day, $200 credit on Azure so that you can sign up for. And as you'll see in the image, there's even certain services that you can run for free for 12 months, certain VM SKUs, so you'll be able to run one specific VM for 12 months. And there's other Azure services that are free indefinitely. And you can run microservices in this. And the important point is to actually get into Azure and start learning about what it has to offer. Perhaps during your planning, you've decided that you're going to move a VM into Azure and run it as infrastructure as a service. But once you've been playing around with Azure, you figure out that you can actually run that code natively in the cloud. What that's going to do is it's going to be more reliable, it's going to cost you less, and it's also going to take a lot of the overhead of managing patching cycles and that off of your plate. But those are the kind of things you figure out by actually getting in and working with Azure and getting to know the tools. And the next important step in making sure that your cloud journey is a smooth one is knowing what to expect. A stumbling block for a lot of people is, as just as an example, they'll spin up a pay-as-you-go subscription and they'll try to deploy a range of VMs, and then they run into resource limitations because there are certain quotas on, for example, how many virtual CPUs you're allowed to have in a pay-as-you-go subscription. Now, it's easy enough to just log a ticket through the portal, you go through the wizard and you request an increase of that quota on that subscription, and that problem is resolved very quickly. But people will be in the middle of a deployment. They'll have planned things out, they'll be in a project plan, and now they hit upon the stumbling block, and they're not too sure how to deal with it because they're not aware of all of those kind of things. So being aware of resource limitations, what resources are available in certain areas. There's great feature parity across the different Azure regions, but there are certain things that are more readily available in different Azure regions than they might be, for example, in South Africa North. So knowing what to expect, do we have to deploy into a different region, and knowing what goes on in Azure. Now, unfortunately, there's always the unexpected. We know that as the meme goes, no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. So this is where it's important to know the tools. Have you run through a test scenario of what you're planning to deploy and come across any kind of stumbling blocks, and then you can plan how to overcome those as you go forward in your production deployment. And of course, as we mentioned, this isn't a sales presentation by any means, but one of the keys to success is having strong partnerships, knowing people who have Azure expertise. And as always, we as Velocity are happy to consult and help you along your cloud journey. The more people who get into and embrace Azure, the bigger and the better the platform is becoming, and the better for all of us. So we're happy to help everybody move along into the cloud. So these are what I would call my 4 key steps: is to plan properly, get to know the tools, know what to expect, and always have somebody who you can phone in case there's a need. And now let's dive a little bit into some of the specifics. This is a bit more nitty-gritty. When you're in that planning phase and you're getting to know the tools, these are the things you need to be aware of to make sure that your long-term Azure journey is smooth and successful. And the Azure Virtual Network, just like a physical office's LAN, is one of the most important building blocks of having a successful Azure environment. Some of these things that we're going to talk about in terms of address space, IP range, network size, these come naturally when we think of a building. We may think, okay, I'm going to put my physical servers into one VLAN. The west wing of the building is going to have a separate VLAN. The third floor will have a separate VLAN. I'm going to put the printers onto a separate VLAN to segregate the traffic. And we know that. We know that's how it works. And these concepts are all similar and the same in Azure. But often we forget to plan for this. So we may not plan the correct IP ranges, and we get into the portal, we deploy a VM, and we accept all of the default configurations, and then we end up with something that's conflicting with our IP range that's on-prem if we want to create a hybrid cloud. We forget to consider our network size because we're anxious to get our first VMs deployed. So the virtual network's a very scalable thing, but then we end up with network address spaces that are not contiguous, and then it becomes a bit more of a chore to manage our routing and our address spaces. So planning your address space, your IP range, your network size is all one of the key and important aspects. Are we going to have a development virtual network that's separate from a production virtual network? Or are we just going to have a development subnet in our overall virtual network that's logically separated through network security groups? We'll discuss a little bit more about the network security groups and that later. But this is one of the key starting points in planning, is plan your Azure network, because your key to success is planning your network right, just like it is on a physical network in an office block. One of the next specific decisions is deciding on a naming convention and sticking to it in Azure. As I mentioned, because of the scalability and elasticity, we can deploy resources at a phenomenal rate into any cloud solution. And we can end up with resources where we've accepted the default values, and now we don't know what this VM does, and we don't know what that network adapter is associated to, and we don't know what that subnet is. And that starts to make things a little bit murky and a little bit cloudy in our cloud journey, if you'll excuse the pun. So having a naming convention and sticking to it is important, because unfortunately in Azure, there's not a lot of resources that can be renamed after the fact. So when we think of our naming convention, we should set the expectation that once the name is set and once the resource is created, no matter what it is, we can't go back and change it. Having that mentality towards our resources is going to help us to get that naming convention right. When we open the portal and we look at resources, we're going to know what's associated with what VM is using what disk, and it's going to be clear, and it's going to be a pleasure for us to get into Azure. The next key thing that we're going to want to look at is our network topology. So when I talk about this, is are we going to have a hub and spoke network? Are there any kind of business requirements that mean we need to separate out our traffic? Are we going to use Azure and Azure Virtual WAN to connect our branch offices? And so when we start planning around our network topology, it means, do we have to upgrade the physical routing equipment or firewalls in our office to be able to establish VPN connections? Do we want standalone cloud environment that we're only publishing apps out to the general public, and we're not connected in a hybrid fashion to our business? Planning around exactly what we're going to do with our Azure virtual network, as well as our on-prem networks, what topology we're going to use separate, or as I mentioned, dev VNets versus production VNets, or are we only going to use a single VNet with logically separated subnets? This is also a very important planning point, along with the address space and network size that we're going to use in our network. And another point, so the next point we're going to chat about and that we will have a look at when we get into the Azure portal is tags. Now, tags are not critical to the functioning of Azure. You can deploy any resource you want without tags, and tags are not going to affect how any resource functions. But making good use of tags and having a good tag strategy is, again, one of those things that your future self is going to thank yourself for now, for implementing now. Tags can follow any kind of hierarchy you would like. They can be used to track resources, divide them and report on the resources, as well as just providing more information at a high-level overview on what resources are being used for. So, as I mentioned, because tags are not critical to the functioning of everything, they tend to get overlooked. But in terms of managing, especially larger cloud environments, having a good and sound tag strategy is one of the key steps to success. And the next point, before you even start deploying anything in the cloud, you should decide on your security roles. As we mentioned, in terms of keeping the cloud secure, Microsoft Azure is going to be far more secure than any on-prem environment can be, provided we don't create any holes in that security barrier that Azure provides for us. And the quickest way we can do that is by assigning too much permission to the wrong people. And if we've gotten, for example, we've gotten off on our journey, now we need to give the developer access to an application or a server, and we weren't quite sure how to do it, so we've given them owner access over a VM instead of contributor, or perhaps a different role, and we go back and we ask them, no, can we reduce your access? They'll say, no, I need all of this access, because it's easy for somebody to just say, leave me with the access I've got. And that can lead to people deploying resources they shouldn't be deploying, or changing things, shutting things down, creating security rules that aren't in line with our policies. So defining our security roles before we start and making sure that people are correctly assigned. We always want to go with the concept of least possible privilege, that people need to do their job and function well. And that's how we're going to manage and maintain the security. The biggest security risk in Azure is our own bad habits and our own bad actions. So having a sound strategy will help us, and having a policy that backs that up as well. So when someone comes and says, I need this level of access, you can say, I'm sorry, we have a written policy that says you can't have that level of access. We can give you this level of access. And again, in terms of flexibility and scalability, you can create and deploy your own custom roles in Azure, down to very specific resource levels and very specific activities and actions that can be carried out. So that's definitely key to keeping your Azure environment and your resources secure. And security is becoming an ever more popular topic for people to discuss in the world today. So definitely something we like to focus on. So these are by no means an exhaustive list of things that you need to look at in terms of getting deployed in Azure, but this is some of the key points that having these set out straight from the beginning, you can work around everything. For example, if you have a large number of resources in Azure and they don't have any naming conventions that work together, or they've got disparate naming conventions and it's hard to keep track of them, you can go back and you can retrospectively implement tags to help you keep control and track what's going on in your Azure environment. So that's pretty much it for the slide deck and the talking. So now we're going to get into the Azure portal. As I mentioned, as I go through the Azure portal, I'm going to discuss a little bit about some of the key planning points and what some of the smaller aspects like resource groups are, and we'll have a look at tags in Azure. So as you'll see on the screen, once you log into Azure for the first time, you'll be greeted with a screen like this. There's not much going on, but as you begin to use Azure, your list of recent resources will come up. And one of the things that tends to be a little bit underutilized is the dashboards. We don't have any resources in this instance at the moment, but as we go through, we'll start pinning things to the dashboard, and you'll see how the dashboard comes alive. But this is the standard home screen, and you can open up the context menu on the side. You can pin your favorite resource types here, for example, virtual machines, app service. These ones that are pinned here are just the default, but you can change your favorites by clicking on all resources. And once the menu pops up, you just tick the little star there to add it. So you just click on it and you add that, and then it will add to this menu's favorites and all resources. However, Azure has become such a large environment to manage and maintain that a lot of the times you'll find yourself just using the search bar. I want to deploy a virtual machine, or I need to get into Azure Active Directory. The search bar is often the quickest way to get into all of these resources that you're going to need. But let's start off by not following my own advice of starting at the ground up. We're going to deploy a virtual machine. As we go through the deployment, we'll let the wizard create the virtual network for us. Now, my recommendation would be, if you're going to start with Azure, start creating the virtual network first. As you go through the wizard process for a virtual network, there'll be more options available, more configuration that you can use to make sure that your deployment is custom to your needs. The default wizards have become a lot better. In the past, if you deployed a virtual machine too quickly before the other one was deployed, you could end up with 3 virtual machines deployed in 3 separate virtual networks. But the Azure portal has become more refined over time. They're doing a lot of analytics to see how people interact with it, what can be improved. One thing that I noticed was, specifically if you're peering virtual networks, you used to have to go into each virtual network and create the peering relationship, but now you do it from one, and the Azure portal automatically creates it on the other end. So Microsoft do a lot of work to keep the Azure portal updated and constantly being refined and smoother for us to use. So let's dive into creating our virtual machine. So the first thing that will need to be selected is a subscription. A lot of people run on a single subscription. Some businesses have multiple subscriptions. You can break up your subscriptions all to meet your business needs. They're associated, or there's a trust relationship between an Azure subscription, which is what holds the resources, virtual machines, virtual networks, and your Azure Active Directory. So a lot of us will already have Office 365. Or Microsoft 365. If you've got Microsoft 365, you have Azure Active Directory. By associating your subscription to your Azure Active Directory, it means when you start implementing things like Power BI instances, that you can use your standard M365 users and groups to assign permissions within those resources. So it's always good to make sure that your subscription is provisioned to your correct Azure Active Directory tenant, whether that's a single one or multiple ones. Some people will have an Azure subscription per region they're going to use Azure in. Some will provide each business unit with an individual subscription so that that business unit can keep track of the costs. And other people find it simpler to just have a single subscription with all the resources in it. But we'll select the relevant subscription, and then it will ask us for a resource group. So a resource group is simply a container to organize your resources. So, for example, if you're deploying a specific line of business application, you might want to add the VM into that. If it needs a specific firewall or application load balancer or something, you'd want to keep all of those resources that share the same life cycle in the same resource group. Now, resource groups are unfortunately just a single point of management, so you can click into the resource group and see the resources. And tags have the benefit of, if you have resources across multiple resource groups that are all contributing towards an individual system, they can all be tagged to reflect that they're associated with a certain application. Now, your virtual network and your VM or your other resources can exist across different resource groups. As I say, it's just a logical container to help you keep track of what's going on with your resources. So for example, I'm going to call this the demo resource group. So when I want to come back and remove all of these resources and not incur extra cost, I know that I just need to come into the demo resource group and clean them up. So for example, if you're going to do a quick dev deployment to make sure that everything works as you expect, you could create a specific resource group for that, deploy everything into the resource group, come back and then clean up everything in that resource group and know you haven't missed anything because it was all arranged in the resource group. We're going to give the virtual machine a name now. I'm going to just call it demo-vm01. When I talk about naming convention, it's popular in many fields in IT that underscore or underbar is used in naming conventions. Within Azure, some resources will support underscore, others don't. I find most universally the hyphen is supported. So as a separator, I like to use the hyphen, but that doesn't mean that you can't come up with your own strategy and the way you like it. There is a document that lists every kind of resource and what characters are and are not valid. So again, in the planning stage and developing that naming convention, going through a document like that and just ensuring that you've developed your naming convention that meets all of the standards will also avoid frustration later on, because you know what to expect. The region, so I'm going to select East US 2. Different Azure regions do attract different costs for various resources. So this is another thing to consider. If you're going to run a brief dev environment and you just want to get something spun up, test it, and then clean that up or delete the resources afterwards, looking through the resources you're going to deploy. For example, East US 2 attracts a lower cost than South Africa North. But if your production environment needs the data to reside in South Africa, obviously then you want to deploy that VM into South Africa. And from a performance point of view and a latency point of view, having the VMs in South Africa would be better. But if you're going to run dev and test environments where that's not a concern, have a look and see where the cheapest Azure region is to deploy those resources. And then there's the availability option, so you can create availability zones and availability sets. This is all when you've got applications and a number of servers that work together. Once you're aware of how the availability zones, availability sets all work and your update zones, you can ensure that no more than one of your VMs is being serviced by patching or updates or any other kind of maintenance at any point in time, especially where you've got a load balanced application running across a number of VMs. Then you would want to start looking at creating your availability zones and sets. We just have a single VM here, so that's not going to be of any benefit, so we won't really deploy any of those options. We're going to go with standard security, and we'll change this to a Windows VM. So let's just do 2016, that's a bit simpler. So it's going to recommend us a size for that VM, but we can go in and we can choose the recommended size, or we can see all sizes and choose any of the other sizes we would like to from the full range of VMs. Again, when I spoke about knowing what to expect, if you're running some kind of pay-as-you-go or a trial subscription, some of these VM SKUs are not going to be available to you, especially on the free trials. Microsoft do limit which VM SKUs you can use to manage capacity, but we're just going to close this and we're going to accept the default value. So we're going to give this a username and a password. Password requirements are quite strict in Azure, so you're not going to be able to put something like password 123. You will need a fairly complex password. As I mentioned, Azure does have a very high level of security. And right from the get-go, on our VM, you're going to see it's going to ask if we want to open any inbound ports. We can select none, or we can allow, for example, RDP. Since this is a Windows server on the Linux VMs, it will be SSH. And for this example, we're going to accept RDP, but you will notice that it's going to give you a warning that this isn't recommended. It should only be used for testing because it is a security concern. If you do have an enterprise agreement, you can check this option on to use your existing server licensing, which will contribute towards a lower cost. Now, you can see we've filled in the basics screen here, and we can click review and create, and it'll take us right to the end. But that means we skip all of these steps, which means we have no say over how our disks are configured, how our networking is configured. And as I mentioned, this is where we start to run into complications on VMs, on virtual networks that don't talk to each other. So we rather want to step through each step. I'm just going to set the defaults on the disk because there is the included OS disk that comes with the machine. So this one's premium SSD. We can start to reduce to standard and standard hard drive. It does reduce costs, but in my opinion, the cost difference is negligible considering the performance uplift of the premium SSD. So we'd want to stick with premium SSD. So for disks, we're going to select the defaults, but if we wanted to add an additional data disk, say we were deploying a file server and we wanted a few terabytes of storage, we could create and attach a new disk here. If we'd simply accepted the defaults and run with it, we'd have to come back at a later stage and add this to our machine. But let's go into the network. So you'll see if we'd selected the defaults, it would have created a new demo VNet for us. And you see what it's done is it's taken from the resource group and the virtual machine name, and it's tried to infer a virtual network name for us. So that might not be optimal for us. Perhaps we do want to create a new VNet, but we want to call it our primary infrastructure VNet. And there you can see it will have given us a default address range, 10.0.0/16. Maybe we don't need an address range that big. So this gives us an opportunity to come in, remove that address range, and add an additional address range. Maybe we need an additional subnet, or we want to rename the subnet. We can here. We're going to call this the primary subnet. So you'll see by getting in and not accepting the defaults, we're already starting to correct some of the errors we make in not having a good naming convention on our virtual networks. As I mentioned before, my recommendation would be creating your virtual network first and then moving on to the deployment of your VMs. There are a few more granular options you can get into when you create your virtual networks before your VMs. But for the sake of this demo and time.
Sorry, we just have a question in the chat quickly. On selecting a premium SSD drive for the virtual machine, how do I know what capacity it will have?
So there's a Microsoft article that lists out, once again, I talk about the Microsoft article, so the best source of truth. Each VM comes with a specific OS disk size, and that is documented in the VM SKUs. They break it down by what the memory capacity is and what the OS disk size is for the VMs. We can forward that out as a piece of additional information, those links to those articles, but it is broken down by Microsoft, and as the VMs get bigger, you do see the OS disk sizes start to increase. And let's just click back to, let's just click OK there, and then we'll go to previous. Yeah, so yeah, the links are in the portal, so you can see, you can click through them and you will find your way eventually through these links to the links that list out the different VM sizes. If I'm not mistaken, we can go back. I think it does also list in when you see all. Sorry, I've clicked the wrong link there. See all sizes. There it has your data disk size, your RAM, CPU's data disk. Okay. All right. Yeah, so it is a bit more difficult to find it from the portal, but there are Microsoft articles that will list exactly for your standard size on a B2S VM what the OS disk size is. And you can find the disk sizes in the Microsoft articles. Again, this would come down to your planning point of view in terms of what size VMs you're going to deploy, and if you're happy with the standard size disks. So I hope that answers that question. Sorry, I can't show you from the portal, but my default is to refer to the article, have a look at the sizes, and then spec your VM SKUs according to that. Right.
Thanks.
Cool. So if we get back to our network, so what we did is when we went through the create new, so we've given our virtual network the name we want, we've given the subnet the name we want, and here we see it, we're going to create a public IP. So I'm happy with the name it's given us here. Some of the times you're going to find the names will be just fine. They'll be perfectly adequate to describe what they are. Sometimes they may not, and in that case you might want to go and actually deploy a public IP beforehand and give it the name you want. You can choose none, or if you had available IPs or public IPs provisioned, you could select one with a naming convention. Perhaps we could create a new one right from here. So if we want to call this inbound internet, and let's just go back and put a space there. So you'll see as you're creating resources, if you do get anything wrong with the naming conventions, the portal is going to pop up immediately and tell you there's a problem. It's not going to wait for you to get to the end of the form and hit next and then say you have to go back and change it. So as I mentioned, the portal does a very good job at helping us make sure that we're doing everything correctly. So if we create a new static IP address, rather than accepting the defaults, we can make it a static IP address as opposed to dynamic. As I mentioned, the more you get into creating your own resources, the more control you have over what your environment is doing. So you don't want to necessarily get into the habit of going and creating every public IP address and every network adapter. But in your case, if it's important to you that the naming conventions are right down granular to that level, then go and create those resources before you provision the VM, so that you can come and select them here in this wizard and have them named correctly the way you want them to. Now it's asking about network security groups. We're going to provision a basic one. So a network security group is, I don't want to use the term basic because it's not just basic or simple in the absolute sense of the word, but it's a basic firewall that you can apply at multiple levels within Azure. So you can have a network security group applied to a specific network adapter of a VM. You can have a network security group applied at the subnet level. So you can really start to create tiers of access between subnets, between virtual networks, between VMs even. So in the past, we didn't have this kind of capacity or ability to easily place firewalls in between individual servers. Maybe we've got a server that just because of the nature of the software that runs on it, it creates a lot of broadcast traffic. And we don't want that broadcast traffic getting out into our great virtual network. What we could do is create a network security group, which, as I say, it's like a software firewall on that network adapter, and block broadcast traffic for that server alone, or block the specific broadcast traffic from that server out to our virtual network. I know the network security groups, they can be a bit tricky because they do apply in a hierarchy depending on where they are and how close they are to the VM or the final source. So it takes a little bit of understanding and playing with and getting to know network security groups to understand how the various rules are applying and which ones would override the other rules. But they are a very powerful resource that costs nothing additional within Azure to be able to apply additional security and additional traffic filtering to our apps and resources in Azure. So you'll see if we move on to public inbound port, you'll see 3389 is allowed because that was allowed on the basic section of our wizard. But we could also, if we're going to host a web app, we could allow HTTP, HTTPS. Within the network security group, we can go and we can add additional ports if our application uses specific ports. The wizard is just the basics or the most popular things that people need to enable. Accelerator network is turned on, we can leave that on. And if we wanted to create a load balancer, we can through this screen. This would then take us through the wizard of creating a load balancer again, but that's maybe something we should think of creating outside of this wizard and then just using. Let's move on to the next screen. So in the management, it's going to ask us about Security Center. So we see we have the basic plan. So every Azure subscription comes with the basic plan of Security Center. If you have mission critical applications and systems running or VMs, I highly recommend looking into the advanced tier of Security Center for the marginal cost that it takes to apply to individual VMs. You get so many more security benefits than you actually realize. So by enabling Security Center Advanced for a VM, you can enable just-in-time access. So if you do have to have RDP access to that VM, someone would have to log into the portal and they say, I want to connect to this machine now, and I need to be able to connect for the next 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour. And then it provisions that access at the network security group level and allows the people to connect. After that time window has expired, it will automatically deprovision that RDP access. So it's a much more secure way of having your VMs hosted in the cloud and accessible from outside, specifically if you're using dev or test environments. For your production environments, I would recommend looking at something like Bastion to make sure that you really are within the Azure ring fence before you're connecting to your service. But let's go into management. Let's go through management. So we can enable boot diagnostics. So this is a great option. In the portal, it lets you see if your VM is booted. It'll show you the last screen. And there are some additional options here. Turning on some of these additional options is going to provision a storage account for log analytics. So you'll see here we're using a managed storage account. If we want to use our own storage account, we can select custom. It'll then allow us to give the naming conventions. By selecting the default here, Azure is going to manage the name of the storage account, and we're not going to be able to manage that. But when it's a managed storage account or an Azure managed resource, we often have very little that we need to interact with those resources. They are often hidden, so you have to check a box that says display hidden resource types because we don't really have to worry about that. For example, VM snapshots. We don't have to worry about the VM snapshots because we take a snapshot from the VM page or we restore the snapshot, so we don't have to worry about the name. It's perfectly fine to let Azure manage some of those things. If we want to control it, again, we can get into the custom level of creating it beforehand or creating it during the resource and giving it the names we want to. So then in terms of the management, it comes with auto shutdown. So we can shut down our VMs because the cost of an Azure VM is calculated on the runtime. So specifically with dev environments, it's often a wise idea to have them shut down at a specific time of the day. Sometimes developers do keep strange hours, but if their development is on a regular cycle and they're only working on those systems during business hours, having them shut down overnight will save you a tremendous amount of the runtime of that VM because you won't be paying for compute. You'll only be paying for the storage it consumes. So you'll see it will send an email to the designated email address. And on that email, there's an option to click on it and delay the shutdown of that VM by an hour or 30 minutes or to skip this scheduled run of the shutdown. Now, you can schedule the auto shutdown through the default wizard here, but you can also create an automation to have the VM power up at a specific time of the day. That has to be done outside of the VM creation wizard. We can enable backup here. That's going to take us through a process of creating the recovery services vault because we don't have one. And again, a recovery services vault is something I would recommend creating before you enable your backups, just so that you can get your naming conventions correct, so that you can make sure that your backup policies are configured correctly. There's quite a lot that you want to go into in your recovery services vault and make sure it's set up in accord with your backup policies. However, from a simplicity point of view, it's literally just a couple of clicks within the Azure portal and you can be up and running with backups on a dev environment. Azure Site Recovery is a replication of your VM, and then you can have Azure manage the patching. So you can manually do it, or which would turn off the Azure management. But from the VM blade, you can actually get in and you can manage the actual patching cycles for your VM. Moving on to the advanced, this is where we can install in the extensions. So there's security extensions, there's automation extensions, various backup extensions. So this would be where we're installing those. Your antiviruses, Puppet, Chef, any of those kind of extensions can be installed from here. So that'll be done during the VM deployment. You don't have to come back afterwards and now start installing particular clients. So if you're running a system and you have licensing that's supported, you can do that straight from the deployment, and it happens at the time of deployment. You can pass scripts through while the machine is being provisioned. So if you do have any kind of configurations that you need to do, so this would be similar to OSD scripts that would be run during a machine provisioning through Windows deployment services or something like that. So you would paste all of that information. We're not going to get too much into the rest of this, but this is more about managing the availability and what hosts the VM sit on. A lot of the time, selecting just the defaults there will be fine, but due to time constraints, we're not going to dig too much deeper into that. And next, my favorite topic, something I wasn't terribly invested in when I started my Azure journey, and I found it's become something that's provided far more value than I ever thought. So we've got a tag. So we can call this it's got a hierarchy. So we can start with top level of our tag, and we can say VMs, so demo VMs, or we could assign this to a department. So accounting department, and we could say that this is debtors. So this machine it's for the accounting department and it's part of their debtors workflow. The tags, as I say, they're very dynamic. We can come up with any tagging scheme or multiple tagging scheme. So you'll see we can assign it to all the resources within the virtual machine, or we only want to apply it to the desk, the network interface, the network security group. So that tag will then be pushed onto the selected resources within this VM. So, for example, demo and VMs will be applied to all the resources. So you can see through the wizard screens that we've gone through today, we're going to be deploying 12 resources into Azure. That's going to be the virtual network, the network adapters, the disks, the virtual machine itself. So, like I mentioned, you could get in and individually create 11 of those resources and then associate them to the VM. But we need to have a look at a balanced viewpoint in terms of what do we really want to deploy. And like I said, the virtual networks, your backup recovery vaults, the items that are going to be permanent mainstays to your Azure environment, we want to get in and have a look at those resources and create them individually and make sure that we have them named correctly. So now we're reviewing the settings. So it's always a good thing to just go through this and make sure that we're happy with everything. I've been through this a few times and noticed some things that I haven't been happy with, and I've had to go back and change. Here it's going to give us our costing of what this machine is going to cost us per hour. We can review pricing on other VMs if we think that's a little bit too expensive. We can review all the configuration. Or if we want to now come and deploy 13 or 14 more of these VMs, we can come and download this template or add it to our library. Or we can keep this template and redeploy this template. We can change the Azure regions if we know how to work with the templates. But if you're going to redeploy multiple copies of the same machine, certainly grabbing a copy of the template is going to help, because you can come back and you can just redeploy that same template into Azure. But we'll hit the deploy button, and this VM is going to take probably about 5 or 10 minutes to deploy, because it's going to, sorry, I was deploying the template. Let's go back. We can create. So with the time we've spent discussing the wizard pages and now the time we've hit deploy, we'll be through this machine and its deployment cycle. This machine will be deployed to Azure with all of the settings configurations, as well as the virtual network we created, in about 10 minutes time. So certainly in terms of flexibility and scale, you can see that Azure is certainly on another level compared to what we could do in a physical data center. What we've done this morning is the equivalent of walking into a greenfields office, setting up the LAN, setting up the networking, setting up the switches, creating virtual networks, deploying an OS to a physical server, and having an operating system run on that. So in the time we've taken to walk through these steps, create and explain everything, we've done what would be days of work on a physical site. So just conscious of the time, unfortunately, we're going to call it there for the Azure presentation or the Azure demonstration. And we'd like to now move back to our presentation just to find out if there's any questions that anyone would like to answer from what they've seen this morning. Just before we get into the questions, a heartfelt thanks to everyone for joining the session this morning. We hope it's been a little bit informative. We've hoped it's helped everybody see that Azure is not as intimidating as some of the articles may make it out to be, or when we're doing our research, we may get a bit intimidated, but there's absolutely no need to be. And we hope this is the first step in helping you dip your toe into the Azure cloud. But now as I say, we're open to any questions that anyone may have.
Quiet out there. Okay, guys. Sorry, Gothi, so you were about to start speaking there. Do you want to say something?
Just going to remind people, if they have a question, to please pop it in the chat. And I am monitoring the chat now.
Yeah, that's sweet. I guess there's not really much more that I can say other than what Garth said on on the subject. It's a calm voice of reason, old Garth, that usually offers some unique insight, and really I enjoy these presentations. I think it's so interesting, and what it also does is it comes out to just show that it's not actually the beast that it could be. It's a vast subject, but when you drill down into the nitty-gritties of it, it can be quite a lot simpler than one initially imagines. Folk, thanks again for everybody for logging in. We really appreciate your time. You will, in the next day or so, be getting a mailer from us to also thank you, but also to be able to book a time with either your representative or one of the guys from the technical team at Velocity. And as Garth said, if you're ever in a situation where you need to phone a friend, make no mistake, we are your friend, that you can give us a shout anytime, and we'll be able to take you through whatever needs to be taken through. That's literally it from me. I wish you all a very successful and very happy December up until whatever time you may be closing down. If you are going away, have a great holiday. If you are traveling, do it safely, and have a fantastic festive season. That is it from my side. Garth, do you want to close out?
Just a couple of questions that have popped up in the chat. I'll close out with those, and then we can close out, or if anyone would like to hang on to answer more questions, I'll hang around. So the first one is, what's the difference between signing up with a credit card and being billed through CSP? So we won't get into the pricing differences or anything like that, but when you sign up with a credit card, you'll be billed on your credit card based on consumption. So at the end of the month, depending on how much you've deployed into Azure, you could end up with quite a large charge going through on your credit card. Where when you're running through a CSP subscription, you will be billed and you'll be presented with a tax invoice on a monthly basis. So what happens at the end of the month, often with some of our customers, their Azure resources have grown, Microsoft processed that charge on the credit card, and now it's over a limit, and then your resources get paused because that payment fails to process, and Microsoft need you to resolve that, which is sometimes it's not quickly resolved. You need to get hold of the bank, company letterheads, and letters need to be drafted and sent to the bank to approve the expense, and all of that leads to downtime. Where on the CSP program, you're presented with your invoice, and then your resources continue running, and in your standard processes and accounting processes, you can pay that invoice. That, for me, is the biggest advantage to moving on to CSP. There are other advantages, but that is one of the important points to note in specifically about being billed through CSP. The next question was a rundown of the use case for Bastion. So Bastion is a secure way of connecting to your Azure resources via RDP. If we think of it in some cases, we used to have a Bastion server that was available in a DMZ or on a specifically VPN network, and you would connect to that, you would RDP to that machine, and then you could access the resources inside your network. The concept is similar with Azure Bastion, except your RDP connection to your servers is handled inside the Azure portal through 443 secure HTTPS. So you have to log on to Azure, you go through your multi-factor authentication gateways and security mechanisms that Azure answers, and then through the Azure portal, you can connect to your virtual machines and work on them through RDP, which is far more secure than having RDP published to the internet. It's also more secure than having a VM published in Azure, or having RDP published on a VM that's sitting in a network, and then RDPing to that VM, and then RDPing into the VMs that are within your Azure environment. Even if you're changing the RDP ports, the brute force attacks do happen, and people are able to sniff through that RDP port redirection and that. So not having any ports published through your VMs directly to the internet is far more secure. Again, you're within the Azure ring fence of security. Unfortunately, a lot of people look at it as an expense, but it absolutely is an asset when you consider how much more secure it is in terms of freeing you up to access your VMs and give you the flexibility you need to not be restricted in RDPing onto your VMs, but having a secure channel to do that. The next question, do you have experience on moving Sage X3 from a hosted environment to Azure? So If you're meaning a privately hosted cloud, there are options available to that. If it's running on a VM in a privately hosted cloud, we can install the Azure Migrate agent onto that machine and migrate that VM into Azure. It all depends on the use case. I haven't had one specifically with Sage X3, but we have had use cases of migrating from private cloud into Azure. And then there was a question, could we get a copy of the recording? Good to reference in the future. That will be a question for Jessica, but I'm sure we can help you out with something there.
Yeah, Jessica will send that with the mail of thanks that goes out in the next day or two. And folk, also, if you don't mind just checking your junk email boxes, sometimes settings make it wind up there by mistake. So do keep an eye on those as well. That it then?
Yeah, I think we're right on time, so I think we can call it there officially. I will hang on a bit and see if there are any other questions that do come up in the chat, but officially I think we'll thank everyone for attending and call this webinar to a close.
That's where it is. Yeah, lovely stuff. Thanks everybody again. Look out for the email, book a session with one of our technical guys. Have a great December and we'll chat to you soon. Cheerio.
Thanks, Chris and team.
Thanks, hey. Ciao, ciao.